Why some African coup leaders get sanctioned and others get support. Brother, sister, if you care about what's happening in Africa today, you need to watch this. This is not just about Burkina Faso or Niger, it's about something much bigger. People took to the streets recently in support of Ibrahim Traoré because they sensed something was off, something deeper than what the headlines are telling us. And history is repeating itself from Lumumba to Sankara and now Traoré. But why is the US so invested in opposing certain leaders? Why do they turn against the very soldiers they once trained? Let's break it down. U.S. congressional hearing exposes a pattern. In a recent congressional hearing, a U.S. lawmaker grilled General Michael Langley, head of U.S. Africa Command, with one core question: why is the U.S. training African soldiers who later stage coups against their own governments? General Langley admitted that over the last decade, the U.S. has trained nearly 50,000 African military personnel, largely through programs like IMIT, International Military Education and Training. When asked how many of those trainees participated in coups, Langley claimed the number was less than 1%. But under further questioning, he couldn't provide hard data. The congressman cited real-world examples like Colonel Mamady Doumbouya of Guinea, trained by the U.S., photographed with American forces, and months later, led a coup. Langley repeatedly emphasized core values taught during training, values like civilian-led governance and democracy. But when confronted with the fact that these same soldiers led coups, his defense began to unravel. Burkina Faso and Niger. Patterns emerge. Let's take a closer look at Burkina Faso. While General Langley didn't mention Ibrahim Traoré by name, he acknowledged that a coup leader from Burkina Faso who had received U.S. training was among those in question. And then there's Niger. Abderrahmane Tiani, now the de facto leader of Niger, also underwent some U.S.-led training just like Doumbouya. After seizing power from President Mohamed Bazoum, Tiani's government demanded that the French ambassador meet with them. When ignored, they expelled him. France refused, saying they don't recognize the coup government and continued to support Bazoum despite being foreigners on African soil. France even declared that its 1,100 troops stationed in Niger would remain, defying the new leadership. Why the U.S. flips on coup leaders? So here's the big question: why does the U.S. turn against the very soldiers it once trained? The answer may lie in control. Many African leaders once in power begin rejecting foreign influence, particularly from Western nations. They expel foreign troops, question exploitative contracts, and call for true African sovereignty. That's what happened with Ibrahim Traoré, with Tiani, and with others across West Africa. These leaders aren't necessarily anti-democracy, they're just not following Washington's script. And that's when the narrative shifts suddenly. They're portrayed as threats, undemocratic, or authoritarian. But many Africans see something else: leaders standing up to foreign domination. In recent months, tensions between the United States and several African nations have reached new heights. But behind the headlines about democracy and core values lies a deeper story, one that raises tough questions about U.S. influence, military training programs, and Africa's right to self-determination. Across Africa, many have begun to speak up. From Ouagadougou to Niamey, the people are asking, why does the U.S. oppose leaders like Ibrahim Traoré? And why does Washington seem so uncomfortable when African nations choose a different path: U.S. military training and coup fallout? Let's start with what's undeniable. Over the last decade, the U.S. has trained tens of thousands of African soldiers. According to a recent congressional hearing, more than 50,000 African officers have passed through American training programs. But here's the issue: some of those very soldiers went on to stage coups. In 2021, Colonel Mamady Doumbouya overthrew the Guinean government. A U.S.-trained officer, he was even pictured with American service members just months before the coup. And in Niger, General Abderrahmane Tiani, also trained in U.S. programs, deposed President Bazoum in 2023. The U.S. called it undemocratic. But many in Niger saw something else: a rejection of foreign interference. Niger, France out, U.S. Next, after the coup, Niger forced French troops out of the country. The French, refusing to recognize the new government, were shown the door. Interestingly, American forces were allowed to stay at first. But things changed when Niger's prime minister visited Iran to discuss cooperation. Soon after, a U.S. diplomat accused Niger of secretly selling uranium to Iran, an accusation Niger fiercely denied and declared this cynical approach is reminiscent of the Second Iraq War. Instead of denying the claim further, Niger took action. They asked U.S. troops to leave their territory. This was a bold move. The U.S. had invested $400 million in a drone base in Agadez, meant to combat terrorism in the Sahel. But Niger made it clear, we are a sovereign nation. Shortly afterward, Russia was invited in. The same base once operated by American forces was now opening its gates to Russian advisors. Guinea. The clock is ticking. In Guinea, a similar story unfolded. Doumbouya cited concerns over an unconstitutional third-term bid by then-President Alpha Conde when he led a coup. Initially, the U.S. condemned the action and demanded a return to civilian rule. But then, the U.S. Embassy went a step further. It posted a public countdown clock on its website, essentially demanding that elections be held by a certain date. For many Guineans, and especially Doumbouya, this crossed a line. The countdown felt like a form of pressure, if not outright disrespect for national sovereignty. The bigger picture, what's really going on? So why does the U.S. oppose these leaders? On paper, it's about democratic norms and civilian governance. But on the ground, it often looks like a battle over who gets to call the shots in Africa, Africans or foreign powers. When leaders like Doumbouya, Chiani, or Traoré push back against Western influence, reduce military ties, or seek partnerships with countries like Russia or Iran, they're suddenly branded as threats. Statements like this, threatening military action if Niger resists, only deepen suspicions. Tensions rise across West Africa as U.S. influence wanes and new alliances emerge. In a growing shift across West Africa, several countries with long-standing military ties to the United States are increasingly distancing themselves from Washington, sparking accusations, diplomatic fallout, and geopolitical realignment. Uganda's controversial moment. Tensions first flared in Uganda after the U.S. Embassy flew a pride flag prominently following the Ugandan government's introduction of strict anti-LGBTQ laws. The move, perceived by many Ugandans as a deliberate provocation, raised questions. Would the United States make such a symbolic statement in nations like Saudi Arabia, which also criminalize same-sex relationships? The incident underscored perceptions of double standards in how the U.S. engages with African nations versus more geopolitically powerful allies. Military coups and U.S. training, a pattern? A notable trend has emerged. A number of African military leaders who participated in U.S.-sponsored military training have later gone on to seize power through coups. However, Washington's response to each has varied, raising questions about whether U.S. foreign policy treats all these leaders equally. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta, who was trained under U.S. military programs, took power and subsequently severed ties with France, pivoting towards Russia. The U.S. responded by freezing assets and imposing travel bans on Goïta and members of the junta, citing democratic concerns. In Gabon, General Brice Oligui Nguema ousted President Ali Bongo in 2023. Although Oligui also received American military training, U.S. reaction was markedly more restrained. Gabon remained open to Western business interests and retained French and American military bases, possibly explaining the softer approach. Gabon's strategic importance in sectors like oil, mining, and timber may have played a role in this leniency. Unlike countries such as Burkina Faso or Mali, Gabon French or American military interests, leading analysts to suspect that economic and military interests influence diplomatic tone. Burkina Faso, a case of contrasts. In Burkina Faso, 2 successive coups reshaped the country. Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who also received U.S. military instruction, initially led the transition. However, he was later overthrown by Captain Ibrahim Traoré in 2022 due to dissatisfaction with his handling of insurgent violence. While Traoré's U.S. military ties are unclear, there is speculation that some members of his inner circle may have undergone American training. Recently, he has come under fire from U.S. officials for allegedly using national gold reserves for personal benefit, further straining relations. Strategic friction and sovereignty debates. Critics argue that Washington's selective outrage reflects broader geopolitical motives, particularly regarding countries choosing to end relationships with former colonial powers or pivot toward non-Western partners like Russia and China. When countries like Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso reject Western influence and forge new alliances, the response has ranged from economic sanctions to diplomatic isolation. Meanwhile, others like Gabon, where the regime change hasn't disrupted Western interests, have faced less scrutiny. The pattern suggests that while the U.S. promotes democratic values and civilian transitions, its foreign policy may be shaped as much by strategic and economic interests as by principle. So what does this mean for Africa? For young Africans marching in the streets? For the future of the continent? Maybe it's time to rethink who's really defending democracy and who's just defending their interests. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think these leaders are heroes or threats? And why is the US really so uncomfortable with them? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives. This is VlogNDC.